Alexis Kerber. This is my final presentation for American Ethnic Studies, starting off with the systemic racism and the two closely associated racisms being institutional and structural racism. Institutional racism focuses on practices kind of within these institutions, like the laws and the policies, while systematic racism focuses kind of on the history and acts of those racisms that encompasses like the ideologies, while structural racism kind of focuses on the interactions between institutes within like time and space. I kind of to get a better understanding. So the unjust enrichment of whites through slavery, privilege, access to resources since the beginning of the United States is at its core understanding of systematic racism. This unjust enrichment has led to unimpoverished of African Americans. So the very first system I want to focus on is the education system. Of the first two groups, it's racial inequalities in the institutes impact across like access of knowledge and resources like textbooks. These have various impacts on outcomes on these minority groups. As before the Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1954, children who were not white were systematically prevented from attending white schools under doctrine separate but equal. As Between 1896 and 1954, it was legal for states to deny all these minority groups access to public schools and other facilities for whites. Before that, it was also the similar case for Native Americans and Indian schools. Although times have changed, segregation persists at similar levels to the past, partly because of school districts aren't like actually required to promote integration, but something that's being done to counter that is what is the affirmative action, policies and procedures to combat discrimination in schools and workplaces, which are some colleges and universities are taking in place to have diversification of those minority groups in their attendance. Um, to kind of shorten the achievement gap, as oftentimes those of minority groups, especially those of low income families, are significantly disproportionate to those of the wealthier, like white families, oftentimes. So they have unequal access to resources, and it becomes a way kind of to diversify and combat that inequality in that systemic racism of the education system, as they're oftentimes disproportionately discriminated in standardized testing, racial stereotypes, and like maybe unfair disciplinary processes within the education system, which like could harm their like academic process or achievements. So going on to how it's like measured. So this is measured through the means of graduation, continuation of school resources, and all the historical evidence to kind of prove that systemic racism. Especially looking at like after high school graduation rates to those who are continuing and those who graduate from college and university. So going into the next system for systemic racism in institutes, we're talking about the criminal justice system, as it is systemically racist. As systemically racism is evident through racial profiling, which is the use of using race or ethnicity as suspicion for as a suspicion, reasonable suspicion for grounds of stops, arrest, surveillance, which has led to disproportionate amounts of discrimination, um, causing monikers like driving while black to emerge, and leading to seven times more imprisonments of African Americans compared to those of white who did similar crimes based on the war on drugs, as it's largely responsible for the 1984 Criminal Control Act, Anti Drug Abuse Act of 1986, Anti Drug Abuse of 1988, the following 2 years after. These are all disproportionately affecting minority groups, leading to overrepresentation of minority groups in the prison system. Uh, Also, causing sentencing disparities as minority groups, particularly those of African Americans and Hispanics, are likely to receive harsher sentences for similar offenses uh, that their white counterparts would. And so this is often measured through rates of incarceration, police encounters, types of crimes committed, and much, much more. Um, Kind of how it's referenced is, although the system may have changed name, it still kind of it still puts people of color as criminals and leaves them behind while still having these same practices from the past. And so, in comparing both education and the criminal justice system, it's important to know that both of these systems perpetuate systemic racism through different mechanisms. Individuals are impacted in the education system, like early on, that changes their opportunities and the way of life, while the criminal justice system mostly affects people after through legal means and the law enforcement institute. So both of these have long-term effects. The education system affects maybe like their economic process, their learning, the social mobility, while the criminal justice system has long-term effects like losing the ability to vote, having limited employment opportunities, and repeatedly encountering the system. Well, both the education and criminal system are characterized as systemic racism. Their manifestation and impacts. It's important to understand, and it's crucial to address for dismantling systemic racism in these institutes, um, such as for education, maybe rebuilding. Or rebuilding and retraining their staff, diversifying their students and their employees, having that community engagement, getting that equal access to all those students, getting them the resources they need to achieve and have success uh, is all like proven uh, to work, especially like the affirmative action, diversifying the students to achieve that higher education. While for the criminal justice system, it'd be more focused on maybe like reforming and more so training on specific officers and the process of reentry and eliminating racial profiling to reduce those cases to one day hopefully no longer have them. And so it's important to understand both systemic racism in education and the criminal justice system to have a better future.